All right, so welcome everyone. This is my Azure Data Factory presentation called My Data Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which is a reference to two things. It is a Wordsworth poem reference, and it is also a Monty Python reference. And if I had a prize, if you can name the sketch, I will usually give you a prize. But I am not with you today, so you'll have to email in your answer, and I'll see if I can get you something at some point. About me. I am a data platform MVP, and I live in Atlanta, and I work at Innovative Architects, and this is how you can reach me. My Twitter handle is JulieChicks, and my blog is datachicks.com, and that is my email address at Innovative Architects. I have been at Innovative Architects longer than I have ever worked anywhere else, and I think that that might be the best endorsement that they could get. But it is a great place to work, and if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see the fun that we have. We just had a great time with Halloween, and so I love Innovative Architects. And that is how this story got started. About a year and a half ago, I had a client that was in the construction business, and you know what happened to the construction business in the year 2008. Those guys all got burned, and so they were coming back, and the guy in charge said, I definitely never want to have an IT staff or buy an on-prem server. And so he was a great candidate for Azure. And so our decision was that we were going to use Azure for everything, so we did Azure VMs to get them up and running, and then they needed a warehouse for reporting. And we said, okay, we're going to do this with Azure. So our plan was to use Azure Data Factory instead of SSIS. But we were going to be doing just standard data integration into a Kimball type warehouse. So that was the plan, and that is my journey. And that is how I got started working with Azure Data Factory. I've been working with it for about a year and a half, and I've been presenting on it that whole time because I thought this is such a great need and opportunity to share what I'm learning as I'm learning it and the pitfalls with everyone. And so that is how we got started. Jason, are you on and available to field questions?
Yep, I'm here. If any question, actually, if any more questions come up, okay, I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm going to be addressing, Jason told me there was a question right as we got started about why Azure Data Factory versus SSIS, and that's definitely something that I have bumped my head up against, and slowly I have figured out some definite reasons why and why not. So, and if there's any other really relevant questions, feel free to ask and interrupt, and I will be happy to answer any questions that we have. So Azure Data Factory, it is an Azure service, and it is a cloud service. And this is the old definition. Azure Data Factory has been out since July 2015. I think they've retooled the definition. But when you used to go to MSNDN, the definition was that it orchestrates, manages, and monitors the integration and transformation of structured and unstructured data. Very kind of a mouthful. Breaking it down, the thing that it's doing is data integration, which is movement and transformation of data. So it is one service that does the integration and transformation of data, orchestrates, and that means schedule. So it's got scheduling built in, and it has to because it's an Azure service. That's one of the major big learning curves that you hit when you're working with Azure Data Factory, is that the scheduling is integral into the actual programming of Azure Data Factory. It's really hard to wrap your head around, and I used to complain a lot about it. But it's kind of necessary, again, just because it's out there in Azure and it's out there in the cloud, and there isn't a nice Active Directory domain controller that can have agent telling it exactly when to go. And then lastly, it has monitoring components, so we audit the thing. So it's most like SSIS, DTS, Informatica, and it can work between anything basically that you can have data in or any kind of compute in. It works between other cloud services, and it does work with on-prem. And in order to integrate between on-prem and cloud services, you're going to need the gateway. I'm actually not going to talk about the gateway. If it's working, they work pretty well. Azure, is always improving, and gateways get versions, and so sometimes they can be a little buggy, but basically they work fairly well. And much like SSIS, you've got your major components of any integration. You've got sources, destinations, and transformations. My key observations, and if you recognize this, we've got the holiday season for those who celebrate Christmas coming up, and this is from the Charlie Brown. This is Charlie Brown's really sad little tree. And this is my analogy that I kind of have had for Azure Data Factory when it first came out. It is constantly improving, and it is a lot friendlier to use now. But it came out as very much a minimally viable product. And it came out, and what was shocking to people who've been doing data integration for a very long time is that it was so different from SSIS. And you would think, okay, I'm finally getting it, I see, and then something else would kind of surprise you. It is really well suited as a glue for other Azure services. And so I think that if you are coming into Azure Data Factory looking for a way to do HDInsight jobs or machine learning jobs, then it probably made more sense than if you were like me coming into using Azure Data Factory as a person who'd done SSIS for years and years and years, and wanting to have it be and perform the tasks very easily that I'm used to performing with SSIS. Really, if you go and look in the portal and you look at the customer profiling sample, it's a wonderful use case for the best use of Azure Data Factory. It has an activity called HDInsight On Demand, and that is beautiful because if you have ever worked with HDInsight, which is Microsoft Azure Service Hadoop, it is quite expensive. And if you leave it on overnight, you can burn through, if you're on an allowance like a lot of us are, you can burn through your $150 allowance in a couple days. And so there is actually, in Azure Data Factory, there is an activity called on-demand activity, and basically what this will do for you is, scenario would be, I have worked hard, I have my petabytes of web logs, I have worked hard to create this big data mining activity, and now I want to operationalize it and automate it and make it go out there every single day and do this thing, and I don't want to I want to easily do that without having to write PowerShell automation scripts. Then I can put the on-demand activity in Azure Data Factory, and it is only going to be charging me when it is actually running. So you get that control, and that's a beautiful thing. It also has components for Azure Data Lake, the storage and the analytics, which I'm real excited about Azure Data Lake as well. And that's kind of like Microsoft's version of the data lake methodology. So I hope you have had or will have a presentation on that soon. And I just saw from Jason's introduction that you've got Ginger Grant coming soon to talk about Azure Machine Learning with Azure Data Factory, and that's another great use case. So you start to see that, yes, it's a data integration tool, but it's very much been built to be the glue for other Azure services. There is Azure SQL Data Warehouse, which is marvelous, which is the APS as a service, basically, and you can load Azure SQL Data Warehouse with Azure Data Factory. So it's wonderful for that. Now, this presentation is not at all about that. This presentation is about if you're coming at it from an SSIS perspective, how do you start to make sense of it? And one thing that really dawned on me, I know we had the question, why ADF instead of SSIS? Again, back to the story of my client, he wanted all Azure and he wanted cost savings. Well, if you have a very finite amount of data integration that you want to do and you are all Azure, SQL Server is getting amazing. Every release, the releases are coming more often, and they're always just, the improvements are vast, and it's just one of the best relational database management systems in the world. But with that comes an increase in cost. And so it's getting to the point where people have often come to me and said, could I do Azure Data Factory, and would it save me money rather than actually standing up an SSIS server simply for data integration? And that's something that you have to examine, but it is something that is worth looking at. Okay, and here is a link back to the HDInsight and the beauty of Azure Data Factory. This is a simpler demo. This is a step-by-step of using the HDInsight on-demand activity. This will step you through it, and it's a very small example so that you can kind of start to understand if you're interested in that. So I just wanted you to have this information, and again, this is one of the strengths of Azure Data Factory. And again, this another example is the customer profiling example, which is right here inside the portal. This is the main environment of Azure Data Factory. This is the Azure Data Factory editor view. And if you go to sample pipelines, go to the customer profiling sample, all you need is a storage account in Azure and an Azure SQL database, not a data warehouse, just a database. And then it will spin up this really elaborate a sample that has Hive and Pig, and you can kind of step through it and kind of start getting a feel for one of the major strengths of Azure Data Factory. Another observation that I've definitely made is that as with everything with Azure, cloud first, and then they can deploy improvements. It's really improving a lot. It came out in July 2015, I believe. And since then, we now have the Copy Wizard and the Monitor and Manage app, and these are two things that have been great additions, and we're going to go over in just a second.
Okay, Julie, we got a couple questions here.
Sure.
With ADF, is it better for small businesses where SSIS is more scalable and better for larger businesses, or how does that differentiation work?
Yeah, I really think my client is small and they were interested in it. I know that this is a huge question that even Microsoft is trying to solve. I think the Azure Data Factory is going to scale better than SSIS ultimately when you're talking about petabytes. I have not run any tests, and I think that if the cost of a license is cost prohibitive, then I imagine that you could do some data integration for reporting and have that be cheaper than paying for a license. I also know that Microsoft has recently come out with an image, a SQL Server SSIS image, that they're trying to address those costs. Ultimately, I think that when you get to the real big data scenarios, Azure Data Factory is probably going to scale better.
Right.
Yeah, because SSIS has limitations in the data flow itself. Because when it was built, memory was so expensive, and by putting a lot of sophisticated ways to control the size of the memory and the data flow, it made it kind of brittle, and it gets hard to manage. Now, at the end of the day, they can both just call SQL and both call other things. The answer is, I really think it depends. I will tell you that Azure Data Factory is immense, and it was shocking to me how much is actually in there when you're looking at it, because it looks like just a bunch of JSON at first. And I could not get Azure Data Factory working for me as quickly as the demands of my project. So I wound up going with SSIS. But that's why I'm here, and that's why I feel like it could have been used if I had just had the lessons that I'm trying to impart now.
Right.
And I would love to keep researching that, and so watch, and I will try and tweet if I find it, but I would love an analysis of, cost and then also speed. But the very first thing Azure Data Factory came out with was, they led with HDInsight activities, and this is what it's for. Yep. So I think, it just depends on what you're doing, too. I hope that answered it, or started to.
Definitely. And then if you already have SSIS, because you already have a full SQL Server implementation on an Azure VM, is SSIS still the preferred method of ETL, say going from SQL Server to Azure DW? Or, which is the quote unquote preferred method. If you've
I
already,
don't think there is a preferred method. I think it's going to be whatever is working best for you. And I think for a while it's going to be that we have a lot more SSIS knowledge out there in our community. But if you have the time, I think it's worth it to do a cost analysis.
Yep.
But if you have an SSIS machine that you're using for other things, it's just, I think the real issue is when, let's say you're a startup or you're a new company, do you want to make the investment in a SQL Server machine just to be your SSIS server?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, because one of the
and I will say that SSIS definitely has more sophisticated integration tools. So if you know that you're going to need fuzzy, lookups or something that only SSIS can offer, then yeah, it's going to be even harder to do that in Azure Data Factory because then you're going to do custom coding.
Yep. Yeah, hopefully at some point here the tool vendors will start building out some of those components because in Azure Data Factory you can bring in .NET libraries and such.
Right. Right. And, as we were discussing, perhaps there is the possibility of being able to call from Azure Data Factory an SSIS batch job at some point. I've been looking at that. So, it's complicated, and it depends.
Yep. Yeah, and as one of the questions said, it seems that Azure Data Factory isn't quite mature yet, and I would definitely agree with that. It's new, kind of like how SSIS was back in SQL Server 2005.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but the thing is, too, when ADF was described to me, it sounded to me like data transformation services because it doesn't have the data flow. And you think, okay, well, I'm losing the power of the data flow, but I honestly, the way that data in the enterprise is scaling and the amounts, a lot of SSIS developers are staying away from the data flow anyway.
Yep. So
again, there's a lot of options, and data integration is hard, as Matt Mason says.
Well, I think we covered the questions and the comments that went with them, so I'll let you get back to the topic.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. And so there's three main components, and I think I have a slide, and maybe it's not flowing with the way I'm talking right now. But what we're going to do today is we're really going to do a hello world, and we're going to be looking at Azure Data Factory if you're coming at it from an SSIS development experience, and at least that's the way it'll make the most sense to you. Now you can follow along if you don't know SSIS as well, but this is going to make I'm hoping to make life easy for people with lots and lots of SSIS experience and who have done a lot of data integration and typical Kimball warehousing methods. So in Azure Data Factory, we're going to have linked services, and in SSIS speak, you're going to be thinking connection manager. So it's the names of your resources and their credentials. You have data sets, and that is going to be your schema of either your table, your CSV file, etc. And then you have pipelines, which are groups of activities. And loosely, you could say that activities are like components. Basically, you are either doing a straight copy, which is the only native activity in Azure Data Factory. The only native activity is a copy. And everything else is, again, going to use a linked service because you're going to be calling a compute that's actually attached to another resource. So basic informations. We have many different dev environments. We've got the Azure Portal Editor. There's an SDK, and you can do projects for Azure Data Factory and Visual Studio. You can use PowerShell to create Azure Data Factory, and there are APIs, so you can actually create Azure Data Factories programmatically, much like you can create SSIS programmatically. Everything at the end of the day, Azure Data Factory, just like everything in Azure, is JSON, and this is my brilliant coworker Thomas Reed, who dressed up as Jason from Friday the 13th, and you can see that he's got JSON on his mask, and I thought that was wonderful. But at the end of the day, everything is in JSON. And just to give you an idea, so the copy activity in its simplest form, let's see, we had a table with stooges, and then we're putting it into another table. It is doing just that. So this is just a representation of what a copy would look like. However, if you do anything more complex, they're going to be created and stored externally and referenced in Azure Data Factory, and this is where it always reminded me of data transformation services. So for instance, this is a Hive query, and this is just looking at the script that is containing that Hive query, and then so that's the top portion up here. Down here below is the JSON that made up the activity inside Azure Data Factory, and you can see I'm just referencing it. So I need those credentials to be able to find it, but actually Azure Data Factory is just going to call it. So I'm going to call this Hello World for old school data folks, and what we're going to do in the demos, I'm going to be done with slides, and I think I'm doing okay with time. I'm about 25 minutes in. We're going to use the copy wizard to copy a text file and a series of text files into a staging table on Azure SQL. One of the major things that I was alarmed by when I worked with Azure Data Factory was, how do I just truncate a table? How do I do simple things that I'm so used to being able to do? And then we're going to use and understand a really important concept in Azure Data Factory, and that is slices. So we're going to talk about slices. All right, so I'm going to go over to my portal. And I have this data factory, Past Cloud VC, and I've sent that to Jason. And here one of us, will make it available for download, but everything that I'm going to do, and probably a little bit extra, is going to be available in a project. You'll have the database, you'll have the files, and you'll have the Azure Data Factory components, and it is a Visual Studio project. So you should be able to recreate all of the things that I'm going to do today, and maybe even a little bit more. But I'm going to live super dangerously, and I'm going to start from scratch. But if something goes wrong, I have my pre-baked data factories to go to. So I'm in the portal. I'm signed in. I am going to create a new data factory, and I need a resource group. So I'm going to use that one and create it where it's closest to you. And here's my list of data factories, so I hit refresh. Okay, so this is the data factory that I just created. Give you a little bit of a tour of the main environment. The place that is my home base is the author and deploy window. And there's nothing in here right now. But this is where you can get templates for everything, and again, it's going to be in JSON. But if I'm starting with an Azure SQL database, oh, it was still deploying. Sorry. Okay. Let me give it a break. Sometimes I just click around to let it think. Okay, here we go. So here is the author and deploy area. And everything here that Azure Data Factory can do, I will be able to create a template in JSON. And this is actually the main environment, the main way that when Azure Data Factory came out in July of 2015, this was the main dev environment. There is a lot of samples, but it was a little bit intimidating. Because it was just basically filling things in here. I'm going to discard this, and I'm going to show you the wonderful thing that came out last year, the copy data application. So this is where I'm going to start, and this is a great way to learn Azure Data Factory, is to step through a wizard. It is going to create all my objects that I need, and then of course you can edit, and you can make copies, and I highly recommend doing this. So let me show you what we're working with. I have a blob container in a storage account. My storage account is JAS store, and I have blob container users. And these are all the same schema, and that's important. And you can see that they're date stamped, and that's going to be important when we look at slices. So I'm going to take a peek at it. You guys can look at it with me. So it's a CSV file, and I've got first name, middle name. This is basically AdventureWorks data that I have abbreviated, just so the demo is nice and simple to look at. So I'm going to take these files and I'm going to load it into, I have a database on Azure called GreenPath, and I have a stage users table, and I have truncated it, so it's empty. So we're going to set up, this wizard will help us set up the link services, the data sets, the pipeline with the copy activity. It will also set up the schedule. So we'll take a look at that. So I'm going to call it pipeline users. And just like the SSIS wizard, you can just run it once and it's kind of a throwaway, but I definitely want to do this on a schedule. I always take the beginning date. I'm starting with the schedule. Again, that's really not how people who do a lot of SSIS and data warehousing, we don't usually start with the schedule at all, but you have to with Azure Data Factory. So let's give us a nice couple of days, and I'm going to go to the end date. I always copy it because you see here it's going to 2099. That's an awful long time away. So in fact, yeah, we'll stop right now, and then I'm going to backtrack it. And that'll become a little more clear why I'm bothering to do this. So this is going to run from Halloween to today. And it is going to run on a daily basis every 1 day. All of these parameters here go into creating the data slices. I'm going to move on. So I'm going to pick my source. I'm going to, remember I said I was going to do Azure Storage, blob storage. So I'm going to call it blob users. Picking my subscription and my storage account name. So that's picked. It scans, it finds everything that's available. I had 2 blob containers. I'm going to use this one. I double-clicked on that. And in fact, now I'm going to grab just 1 file. And then I have to say choose. And that one's easy to forget because it's all the way over on the right. So I have 1 file. I'm going to click next. It's detecting the format, which is nice. So I know it's comma separated. This is very nice. Column names in the first data row. So it's going to grab those for me. So you can see, just like I showed you down here, here is a preview of my data. And then I got to pick my destination. So it's an Azure SQL database. Those are all the options here, but I know I'm doing Azure SQL. I'm going to change the name. That's all I'm doing because it'll give you a default name, but I'm going to change it. Whoops. Sorry, I think I mouse padded it. User stage, call it that. I get to pick the database. I have several databases on this server, but I wanted GreenPath, and it has remembered my username and password. Then I have to pick the table. I think, hang on, source. I'm sorry, I backtracked and I thought I was on the destination and I was actually on the source. So let me go back and get, starting with the source as storage. I apologize. Okay. Users. Going back, what happened is I lost all of that, so I apologize. Now I'm picking the format of the file, column names in the first data row. Get to see that twice. Now I'm at destination. GreenPath. Okay. So here we are at mapping. So I'm picking the table from my destination server. And it does an auto mapping, but if this just said MN or M name, I could map it. If these were out of order, I could map it. So that's wonderful, and we didn't used to have that until this feature came out. And then we have this wonderful feature down here called the repeatability settings, and this is where I started to unravel the mystery of where I could tell it to truncate. So if I select auto-generated cleanup script, I see that I have some JSON, and it is trying to help me. It's saying delete the stage users, and it picked date added from my source, and it said that looks like a likely candidate for when the slice would start and end. So it's going to match up when the schedule starts from the window start to the column in the table. So that's where I started to realize that that's how it does it. I'm going to skip that for now, but I just wanted to show you that this is a possibility, and we are going to look at it, and then you'll have that knowledge. Okay, and then we are just going to, again, this is something I like to do. I'm clicking edit because, again, it puts these weird user names in here that I don't like. I want it to be nice, and I'm going to save it. So, and DS is for data set, and that's just what I'm doing. And then I save it. And these are all objects that are going to be in the JSON. You'll see them show up later. Copy settings, you can have it retry several times. I don't want it to retry more than once. Okay, and now we're finally finished, and we're going to see it is now deploying. So it's creating the connections, the data sets, the pipelines. It's doing all that for us, which is marvelous, and I'm going to go over and take a look at what's cooking. So you can see it has started to create these objects. It looks like it might be all the way finished. All right, and this is hard to look at. This was completely empty before we ran this. This is what it creates. Here's the services, which are my credentials and my resource names. The data sets, which are the schemas. Okay, and the pipeline, which is the group of activities. So we've got one activity in here, which is a copy activity. Here's the mapping. So you can see how this is so essential. Having this wizard is so helpful in figuring out how to do something custom. My input is the dataset user. My output is the dataset stage user. How this is great, an easier way to look at, to go back to the main window in the Azure Data Factory editor and go to the diagram window. Unfortunately, we can't go backwards. We can't create objects in the diagram window. And the reason that I wanted to start this demo with a completely blank data factory is that one thing that is hard to get used to with data factory is that everything goes on one diagram. So it can get a little hard to read pretty quickly when you have a lot of data flows. So let's take a look and see how it's doing over here. The way to do that, and Ginger Grant covers this in her blog, one of the best ways to do this is to go to the diagram, go to the output data set, double-click that, you get a properties window, and you see the slices that we created. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but remember when I said that the data slices are basically a result of the availability and the schedule. So the availability was daily, every day, and the schedule was between Halloween and today. So we created 3 data slices. And one of them is running right now. And if I double click it, I kind of get status on that specific slice. And this one, now that it says it's ready, that means it's succeeded. And let's go take a look at the table. It was empty. And now there's definitely data in it. If we look at this file, this is our source. There's only, I cheated, I know. There's only 11 rows in here. And if you look here, you can see that there's a lot more rows. There's 22 rows. This is how you start to figure out how Azure Data Factory works and the way that slices affect everything. And this is really confusing for folks. There's 22 rows in here because that same file ran through twice. And then you look, you can see it's because we created 3 slices, but we didn't filter it in any way. And we also didn't truncate in between runs. Also, if anyone is wondering, the reason that this slice is pending execution and hasn't run yet is that it's waiting for the proper time. So it's gonna kick off at, I don't know, at the end of this slice period. So probably like 1:40 a.m. is when it's going to kick off. So it's run twice. One is waiting. If you ever wanted to rerun a slice, you can do that. And again, this is really hard to figure out. You could do that by going from the diagram to the output data set. Over here in the properties, look at the slices, pick one, double click it, and then click run, and it will run it again. So that's bizarre for folks like me who do a lot of integration and aren't used to that, where basically the schedule would be controlled by agent or something else like that. So let's start tackling that. How could we, and does anybody have any questions, or does anybody want me to go and show them something else? Because I know sometimes you can get a little lost. Okay.
Yeah, no, there's a couple questions, but not related to this specifically. So.
Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to show how to truncate this table. And this is a wonderful property that I found. I'm going to go to the author and deploy, and it is inside the pipeline. And we have sets of properties, and when you do a copy, you pick your type of sync, and this is a SQL sync because we are syncing to a SQL type link service. What I can do is I start with my quotes, start writing some JSON, and I know about a property called SQL Writer Cleanup Script. So I start typing SQL Writer Cleanup Script or SQL, and it comes up. JSON's all key value pairs. So this is in the wizard that portion of JSON that was trying to delete. But I thought to myself, why would I want to delete when I'm just doing a staging table? So I'm just going to truncate. So I'm making a change. You can see I have an asterisk beside it now. That means there's a change. I'm going to have to redeploy this to get the change to take. I also had to make sure you put a comma afterwards, otherwise your JSON is badly formatted. So I'm going to deploy this now. It takes a minute to deploy. I'm going to go back and do my old trick to get it to run again. Oh, it's still provisioning. Okay, now we can go there. Back to the diagram, back to the output data set, and I'm going to rerun one that is in the past, that is able to run. Click on it over here, and then I go to run. And then usually what I do is I just close this all out. Okay, it says it's in progress, and now that slice is in the status of running. And it shouldn't take long. And so now you can see, and the date stamp is changing because this is actually a default date stamp, that I managed to get it to truncate and reload. So that's a win. So going back to the deck, I wanted to show you this to help you. The slices. Number of slices is the result of the availability in the data set related to the schedule and the activity. There's also availability in the activity. So if I have availability of day, an interval of 1, and the schedule that begins 10:29 and ends 11:02, then I'll get 5 slices. And it will, if you backdate it, it will crank them all up and they'll all be sitting there.
Okay, Julie, got a question here.
Sure.
The question is I see how Data Factory adds new records. Is there logic to use it to update existing records, like changing prices in a catalog or adjusting inventory?
Yes, there is. You can run a store procedure. And I have an example of that over in another Data Factory. But let's see. If I go to the one that I actually have the example for you, and I go to, I'll show you this. So this is kind of the fully baked, like the whole pie that comes out of the oven. Here's what we just did. So we did blob user to stage user. And then here is another activity, and we'll take a look at it. This is called load dim user. I am absolutely doing nothing but calling this stored procedure, which is something I would have loved to have known how to do when I first started. So here's the stored procedure. It's doing a merge, a merge statement. So it's basically updating it using the email address as the business key. So saying, okay, have I seen you before based on the business key? If I've seen you before, has anything changed? So it would detect that, it would do it. So this is a type 1 dimension. If I haven't ever seen you before, then it would insert it. And if I'm just calling that, I would do that with going into the JSON. It is an activity. It is a SQL stored procedure activity. And you can see when I'm inside a pipeline, I can say add activity, and I can do stored procedure activity. Again, vastly improving Azure Data Factory all the time, because when this first came out, we could only do it on Azure SQL, but now with the gateway, you can actually do this even to on-premises SQL servers. So you just step through it and put the proper things inside the proper values. So that's the name of the stored procedure. I have an input, which was my output of the staging, and then what's interesting is that stored procedure activity has to have an output, but it can be a dummy. So this is literally doing nothing other than fulfilling the need to have an output data set.
Okay.
If I look, yeah. So does that answer the question that it's definitely possible? And
yeah, and then a follow-up question is it better to think of this as an ELT versus an ETL when using it?
Yes, absolutely. That's why I was saying that everything that is a transformation is referenced. There are no internal, the only thing that is internal to Azure Data Factory as a transformation, quote unquote, is the copy. And that's why it reminds me of data transformation services, because that's how it's really a control flow of other programmatic bits. And the trick is just learning where they are and how to use them. Okay. So, and this is what is in the example that is available. This whole Azure Data Factory as a Visual Studio project, so that you can see going from blob to staging, and then just simply calling a store procedure to load it all the way into maybe a dimension. So if we go back to, I want to show you how slices can really be your friend. So go back over to my blob container, and you can see that these were date stamped. So Azure Data Factory only has 2 types of system variables, and they are related to slices. Okay, so they have slice start, and that relates to the data set. So if I've already done this. I pre-cooked this. I didn't trust myself to be able to actually program it live. But if I look at this again, it's the exact same data set. I'm just making a change and pipeline. I'm just making a change to a few things so that we can use slices. I have an input users that's the same input, the same CSV files, only if I look down here where I would have the hard-coded actual file name, you can see I've got curly brace variables in here. And that tells the Azure Data Factory editor to look at these and to fill them in, just acting like a variable. So down here is where it is, the partition by method is relating to this. So I've got file name users underscore, and then here's a set of variables. The year goes with this year value, and the slice start is a system variable inside ADF. So it is, if I run the slice for September 27th, it is only going to load that file because it actually parses it out and grabs the right one. And just so you know, I did an experiment. These are not the curly brace year variable. Those are not system variables. I could put any value I want in here, but it just makes sense to put year. But I actually tried this. I did month, day, goat, and then I did goat down here, and it worked just fine. So this is whatever you want it to be, but use something meaningful so that it'll work. And I can show you this working. If I go to this particular, and you can see this one's bigger, it's got more stuff, but over here is the pipeline that has all those parameters. This is the one that is parameterized. If I go to its data output, and it has a truncate as well. So if I run just the 29th slice, the slice says it's the 29th, so what it should do is it's going to truncate, and when we look at the table, only the data from that one file is going to be in there. So, and sometimes it makes me nervous, like it's not listening to me when I tell it to run. But that's that's another challenge to working with Azure. There's a little bit of latency. There we go. Now it's running.
You know, while it's running there, Julie, quick question that hit another one of these questions. Can ADF pull from an FTP site?
I think so, yes. Let's take a look. I think I saw that. The best way to look, because they're constantly updating the sources, is to go and look and then just see what shows up, because it's constantly improving and they're adding. File system, FTP server. So yes.
Awesome.
Yep. Okay, so this worked, and so that is a wonderful way to control your slices, because the first thing that people say to me is, oh my gosh, I set it up for the schedule and it loaded it 3 times. How do I stop that? So this is one way to stop that. The other thing is sometimes you just get a runaway pipeline in general. And again, this is a brand new app that comes with Azure Data Factory, the Monitor and Manage. This wasn't here when it came out in GA. It opens up another tab in whatever your browser window you're using. And it shows you everything that you've got deployed. And it gives an operator the ability to right-click and just pause. Or you can also change the schedule from here. So if I were to pause that, it is going to make a change to the underlying JSON. So I always go back to home base, go to author and deploy. And which one did I do? Copy pipeline one file. Copy pipeline one file. Look over here. It's paused. So I hope that that will help some people with some trials and tribulations. Let me look at my list and see if there's anything else I wanted to show. There is not. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, we do have a few more questions.
All right.
All right. Let's see here. Where did I leave off? Make sure I get them all. So how do you decide whether to use Azure Data Factory or SSIS to do ETL to an Azure database?
I would look at cost. I would look at where my organization is wanting to go. And I would look at my staff. If you have people who if you don't have SSIS developers and someone's having to learn it anyway, then maybe you want to look at Azure Data Factory. I think you need to look at your volume and do you need to stand up a separate SQL server? Do you need to pay that licensing cost? Do you want to? Do you have it already? Is it going to be cheaper to use Azure Data Factory? Also think about how much other Azure services are you going to use. If you want to do Azure Data Lake, which I think is a really good option, I would love to see more Azure Data Lake as maybe the actual staging sources. Instead of staging things in staging tables in a relational, maybe use Azure Data Lake as the staging. If you're going to be dealing with that kind of hybrid environment and utilizing other Azure services, then you probably want to lean towards Azure Data Factory. It's really, I wish I could give you more, like a really good formula. I don't have one that's that precise yet, but those are the things that I would take into account.
Okay, and is there a cost for Azure Data Factory if you already have Azure Database?
Yes, Azure Data Factory is pay for use. And everything, you know, in Azure there are, with Azure SQL, there's DTUs, data transformation units. So in Azure Data Factory, they call them data movement units. So you get paid, you pay a little bit for just having an Azure Data Factory deployed and it's sitting there, but you pay a lot when you're moving the data from other services. Just like everything with Azure, you pay when you use it, or you pay when you egress, when it egresses.
All right. Does SSIS have more functionalities than ADF?
Yeah. Yeah. Like we were talking about, the Azure Data Factory is more of a glue and an ability to reference other programming functions and bits. It doesn't have as much native. It's broader, you know, like it is really, it's a great tool for gluing the machine learning together, Azure machine learning, well, God, we were just, HDInsight, really good for that, but it doesn't have as many native components as SSIS does.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have a list of any trusted, reliable references for, sources for, the documentation on attributes for the link servers, services, data sets, pipelines, gateways, etc.?
Yeah, it's all on MSDN for Azure Data Factory. There used to be an entire glossary for the JSON, but that has been moved. But if you go, I have a link in here. It's all in MSDN. The slide that I had shown you that had the beginning HDInsight link, that is a great place to start.
Right.
When you go there, you will see all, here we go. If you go right here, just Azure documentation, and then you can get to a lot of other links. All of this in here is all very helpful. Reza Rad is another good resource. He's done Azure Data Factory blogging, and Ginger Grant has done blogging on it. I'm not sure Melissa Coates has done any blogging yet, but I know that she probably has, because I know she's working with it. So those are other good references.
All right. Are the dates for times for Azure Data Factory, are those in UTC or local time, or some
UTC?
Okay.
UTC. You can do offsets. there's properties for offsets. I didn't use any in this demo.
Okay. And if you have a development workflow where you test on a dev server and then you want to switch to a prod server, what is needed to do that switch through Azure Data Factory?
So I believe that you can templify, you can make templates out of things, but what I would recommend would be putting it in Azure Data Factory, I'm sorry, in Visual Studio. So if you go to Visual Studio, I have this pulled up. You go to Server Explorer and log in with your Azure account, and then you probably should be doing most of your development from here. I'm just recently getting where I am exporting my stuff into Visual Studio, but from here, then you can deploy it to the different environments. I would recommend this as probably the best practice, because I right-click here and then I publish, and I could pick my subscription, pick my resource group, and I think that would be the cleanest way to do it.
All right, sounds good. I think I've hit on most of the questions. I'll get them over to you, Julie, after the webcast as well. We are
Wonderful.
up to the end of our hour, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
And look forward to having everyone back again in 2 weeks. And based upon the amount of attendance here, it sounds like Azure Data Factory is a fairly popular topic, and I would expect that we'll probably have more sessions on this topic.